Thank you. So this is being recorded. There's also closed captioning should be enabled, so that should be at the bottom of your screen if you need it. But good afternoon. Welcome to OCFS's webinar celebrating the 34th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. My name is Angelica Kang. I use she, her, they, them pronouns, and I'm the Chief DEIA Officer. And for those who may need a visual description, I'm an Asian American woman with medium length black hair. I have glasses that are clear frames with gold speckles in them, and I have a black shirt with a green cardigan over it. I'm also speaking to you today from land referred to as Niskayuna in New York State. This is originally land of tribal nations, many of whom are still fighting for recognition and sovereignty today. This land is home to the Mohican, Haudenosaunee, and Schaghticoke. We are grateful to the Native peoples on whose ancestral lands we gather, albeit virtually, and we make this land acknowledgement, not to virtue signal, but to ground ourselves in the understanding that our lives and stories are interwoven and that there is much healing and growing we can do together. Our history of our communities' struggles for justice and rights inform and empower each other. And if you want to see what Indigenous land you are on, wherever you're joining us from, you can use the site called Native Land, and we'll throw that in the chat. It's a really cool site. I really recommend you check it out. I'm so glad you joined us today for what is going to be a great webinar. We are celebrating the 34th anniversary of the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA was signed on July 26, 1990. This landmark civil rights law protects people with disabilities in many areas of public life and is intended to help ensure that people living with disabilities are given the same opportunities as the non-disabled. I know that we are quite a few weeks since July. We had to postpone this event several times, but it was really important to not skip or cancel despite the complications, because this day deserves celebrating, even if belatedly. Today's event will include a presentation from Denise Figueroa, Executive Director at the Independent Living Center of the Hudson Valley, on the history of the disability justice movement. We'll also hear from the Commission of the Blind on their services and how they play a critical role in disability justice. There will also be time for a Q&A with Denise and with Julie Hovey, the Associate Commissioner of the Commission of the Blind. So as we go into today's presentation, there's just a few things to consider or remember. A disability is any condition of the body or mind that makes it more difficult for the person with the condition to do certain activities and interact with the world around them. For a long time, far too long really, disability has been stigmatized and mystified and used to marginalize and limit the lives of the disabled. More than 1 in 4 adults have some type of disability, and disabilities can be physical, behavioral, developmental, and/or sensory. You can be born with a disability, or you can acquire one at any point in your life. Disability impacts everybody, whether it is you or somebody you know, love, care for, or work with. One person's disability is not like the others, and compounding factors in how disability impacts one's life are other identities such as race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and gender identity. I would also say socioeconomic class fits there too. At OCFS, the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility is committed to ensuring that the lives and experiences of people with disabilities are celebrated, empowered, and valued. This work includes shifting thought, attitudes, actions, and behaviors around disability, both in the workplace and in the delivery of our services. We want to move from a framework of disability rights to one of disability justice, where all bodies are unique and valid, and all bodies have strengths and needs that should be met. We're also so lucky to have the Commission of the Blind at OCFS. The Commission is leading the way in ensuring people with disabilities are given the same opportunities as the non-disabled, with its vocational rehab program, business enterprise program, and independent and adaptive living services program. CB has been great partners in the work of institutionalizing accessibility, and I'm so appreciative for their friendship and partnership. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julie to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelica. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Denise Figueroa to everyone here at OCFS. I've had the pleasure of working with Denise for over 20 years since I've been at the Commission for the Blind. She has always been a true partner, always willing to explain things to us, and works hand in hand with us at the Commission for the Blind. Denise has been a leader in the disability rights movement for over 40 years. For the past 37 years, she has been the executive director of the Independent Living Center of the Hudson Valley with offices in Troy and Hudson. She has also been a member of the Board of Directors of the Capital District Transportation Authority, otherwise known as CDTA, since 2003, and served as the chair of the board for 3 years. She is a public member of the most Integrated Setting Coordinating Council, the MISC. Ms. Figueroa holds a master's degree in rehabilitation administration from the University of San Francisco and a bachelor's degree from Brooklyn College. She has lived in the Capital Region since 1985, and it's my pleasure to introduce a friend and a partner, Denise.
Thank you, Julie. It's very nice to be here. Even if it's virtual, always prefer in person, but thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the disability rights movement and my role in it, as well as the history. So I guess I'll just get started and tell you a little bit about myself first, and that is that I grew up with my disability. I contracted polio as an infant back in 1955, so I am going to be 70 this year, which is terrifying to me. But anyway, that's another story. I have been involved. I've been a person with a disability, obviously, the majority of my life. I was 10 months old when I got polio. So I've only known being a person with a disability. I started using braces and crutches as a child, and used those until I got to college. And growing up, in the 50s and 60s, the world was a very different place than it is now. We didn't have building codes that required accessibility. We had no accessible transportation. And we certainly, had no requirements that kids with disabilities even be served in schools until the 1960s and 70s. So growing up, the experience was very different for me. It certainly, as a child, I think that because of feeling as if I was being treated so differently, I never really wanted to associate with other people with disabilities. It was not something that I had any pride about. It was something that you grew up wanting to not be that person. We dealt with telethons that tried to raise money off the backs of children with disabilities, talking about, don't let your child, be one of these. If, God forbid your child be a person with a disability, or handicapped, as the terms were, and even crippled at the time, so the terminology was something that was just difficult to deal with. Nobody understood what it meant to have a disability. They didn't know what polio was, other than something to be afraid of. And so that was the atmosphere that I grew up in. I was born and raised in Brooklyn. My parents moved to Connecticut when I was young, an infant. And so for 5 years, I lived in Connecticut when I started school. And because it was a small town, I was the only person with a disability there, and I couldn't climb the school bus steps. And it's interesting how sometimes in small communities, you can be accommodated in ways even when it's not required. And since I was the only kid with a disability, they sent a taxi cab for me to go to school instead of the bus. My sisters, but I went to school with my sisters, and the accommodation was somebody would help me carry my books. Somebody would help me with my lunch tray, and I used braces and crutches to go to the classroom, which was, since I was the only one, it was integrated. When we moved back to New York City, however, it was a totally different experience for me. And that was back in 1964. Again, prior to special education classes in New York City, they had something called health conservation units. And they were in the public school, but you were segregated from the rest of the kids. and there were only a couple of schools in the borough that I could go to that were accessible. Even though I used braces and crutches and could climb the stairs, they made sure that they sent you to a place where you could get in. And so I had to get bussed out of my neighborhood to go to a different school. And in that school, there were four grades in one classroom that shared the same teachers. So it was, as I said, a real eye-opening experience for me. I couldn't understand why I couldn't go to school with my sisters. I had four sisters who went to the neighborhood school. So I spent a lot of time being very upset and resentful about all of it. I also was realizing that I knew a lot of the work that was being done because I left Connecticut in second grade. I was going to a classroom with first to fourth graders, and they were doing second grade and first grade math. And so I remember talking to my mother and saying, I already know this work, and I was being put on the honor roll, and none of it made any sense to me. And we ended up going to the parochial school and taking me out of school altogether, so that I went to a parochial school and got mainstreamed again. So it was very varied experience going through school, but all of it was around feeling, as if I was being treated unfairly and differently because of my disability, which of course I was. And when I went to high school, I again went to public high school, but it was a little different, and you were more integrated into your classrooms. So, again, as I said, I did not want to be around people with disabilities, because for me, it just meant that I was going to be treated differently. I didn't like the way I was being treated, and I didn't like the way people, it felt all very condescending. And so when I got to college, is when I really got introduced to the disability rights movement. And that was in 1972. And I always say a lot of it just was timing. It was a time when the college campuses were very active. We had just come off, the civil rights movement, and the women's rights movement was very active at that time. And so the college campuses were very active around all sorts of rights and justice issues. And disability rights was kind of a natural growth of that. I went to Brooklyn College, where I met other people with disabilities. Some of them I had gone to high school with, but I was asked to go to a meeting of the student organization for kids with disabilities, or for people with disabilities, and it was called So Fed Up. It was the student organization for every disability, United for Progress. And so it was a handful of students who had been very active on campus, advocating for accessibility on the campus. They were recruiting people to be involved in the organization, and I went and, heard the speakers, and I think it ignited me to realize that we could get more accomplished working together, and actually make changes. And because the campus was accessible and there was an openness, it felt like there were possibilities to change things. And of course, I also met the person who I ended up marrying, Pat Figueroa. He was running for vice chair of that group, and he was also recruiting people to go to a demonstration in New York City. And as I said, I had not been active or even wanted to be around other folks with disabilities for because I was being forced to. But when it became my choice and it was my option to do it, I realized that it was empowering. So I went to this demonstration, which was in October of '72, and it was a demonstration against President Nixon at the time. He was running for re-election, and he had just vetoed the Rehabilitation Act of 1972. And that act was the first time that there was a paragraph in there, Section 504 of the Rehab Act, that said that no otherwise qualified person with a handicap at the time, but disability in the United States shall be discriminated against solely based on their disability. in a federally funded program. So it was really the first civil rights legislation or language that would have been put in legislation, and he vetoed it. There was also funding in there for independent living centers. And so he, we went and demonstrated. I got to meet all these people who became leaders in the disability rights community across the country. But at the time, it was really focused in New York. Judy Heumann was the president of Disabled in Action, and Judy was a force of nature. Even then, she had sued the New York City Board of Education because they had refused to give her a teaching license because she used a wheelchair. They said she would be a fire hazard, and that she wasn't able to be safe in the classroom. And so she sued the Board of Education and got the right to teach in the schools, and did. But she had also formed an organization called Disabled in Action, which was made up of a cross disability of people with disabilities, not just physical disabilities. And the Nixon headquarters was one of the first ones that we demonstrated against. And so we marched from Federal Plaza in New York City all the way up to 52nd Street and 6th Avenue. It was an incredible experience, for somebody who was 18 years old, getting involved like this. It was really something. And my poor parents, who of course had never expected me to get involved in any demonstrating, were pretty horrified at the whole thing. But, it was really my introduction to the disability rights movement, and I am so grateful for it. I get to meet Judy and Pat and Bobby Lynn and so many other people that became directors of independent living centers as the independent living centers evolved. So, as I said, Nixon he had vetoed the Rehab Act. He was reelected. The act was reintroduced back in 73. We marched in Washington and advocated for it to be passed. He vetoed it again, but there was an override of the veto, and Congress did actually override his veto, and it was passed. So that was really the beginning and the seed for the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was only that one paragraph, and then there were regulations that were developed by every federal agency. It only affected federally funded programs and state and local governments to a limited extent. And out of the regulations, or trying to implement these regulations in all the court cases and the fighting, the American Public Transit Association, that I am now on the board of nationally, was a strong advocate against implementing Section 504 of the Rehab Act, and then later on with the ADA, because they felt that transportation was a social service, not that they didn't need to make their public transit systems accessible. So at any rate, I think it's important to know that before the ADA, there was this legislation, this federal legislation that was the seed for all of it. And really what happened was, because of all the litigation, the folks who were involved in the disability rights movement, Justin Dart being one of the leaders, he went across the country doing press, not only press conferences, but taking public testimony of people with disabilities, and talking about the discrimination stories, how they had been discriminated against in employment, in housing, in just every part of their life. People who had been institutionalized and how they couldn't get out and couldn't get into housing. And so Justin, who was this very wealthy man who had polio as well, he took his resources and used them to push for the Americans with Disabilities Act. And he was really one of the people who was kind of the father of the ADA, if you will. Justin gathered this testimony. He presented it to Congress. The thing you should know about Justin is that his family was a Republican family, very wealthy. His father had been part of the kitchen cabinet for Ronald Reagan, and when President Bush was elected, he was appointed to chair the Rehabilitation Commission, RSA, in Washington. So he became the chair of RSA, and so he used his influence and his power to really push the ADA, along with other advocates who ironically were Republicans. You know, we always traditionally think of the Democrats as being the ones who are, you know, fighting for civil rights for people, but in this case it really, disability crosses every you know, every boundary, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, you're, you know, whatever race or ethnicity you are, whatever income level you are, you can become disabled at any point in your life, and it does affect so many people. And I think that that's been one of the successes of being able to get legislation like the Americans with Disabilities Act. We've had to fight to keep it, and there have been many battles over the years. But you know, the fact that it does affect everybody, regardless of where you come from, I think that it's you can make that connection. So that you know, brings you to the passage, I mean, of the ADA, and you know, we had to fight to get it. There was quite a battle, you know, in the Senate and in the House, but it did finally get passed, and it was signed in 1990 by then President Bush. And as I said, again, it was people like Evan Kemp and Justin Dart, Lex Frieden, names that you can look up. And I mean, they have just been phenomenal advocates, along with Judy Heumann and others, you know, who were really responsible for getting the ADA passed. The independent living centers, the role of the independent living centers really was the grassroots. I was the president of Nickel. You know, I was on the board of Nickel when the ADA passed, and became the president after that, the National Council on Independent Living. And that was an association of independent living centers across the country. And, you know, when they needed to call people, when people needed to show up, bodies needed to show up at the White House or you know, at Congress, it was the people with disabilities from the independent living centers that showed up, and also an organization called ADAPT. I don't want to dismiss their role, because they were very active in promoting accessible transportation. That was their original focus, and then it became attendant care. But ADAPT also organized the crawl up the steps of the Capitol. It was a famous event that happened just prior to the passage of the ADA. Literally, people with disabilities getting out of their wheelchairs, or, you know, people with other types of disabilities crawling up the steps of the Capitol, begging for their rights. It was very powerful, and I think it moved a lot of the folks that were, you know, maybe not going to vote for it. You know, the battle after it got passed, of course, was then to get regulations issued. You know, because it doesn't matter about the legislation if you don't get the regulations issued. Again, you know, it doesn't get implemented. And so there was, you know, an effort, at least this time around, instead of Section 504, it was a battle to get the regulations out. That took demonstrations to get the regulations out. And if any of you have ever seen the documentary called Crip Camp, I would recommend that you look at it. It's on Netflix. It talks about that battle. It talks about Judy Heumann, or Judy's one of the main characters in it. But anyway, it shows the whole effort to get regulations issued for Section 504 of the Rehab Act. But they, you know, it required a lot of training of agencies, and the independent living centers have been involved in doing that kind of advocacy and training, trying to educate the public. You know, you can pass legislation, but if people don't understand why it's there, and they still think it's only for a few people, you know, it's very hard to get things implemented. And as Angelica said in the beginning, you know, changing attitudes takes a lot longer. It takes a lot more than just passing legislation to do that. So that's kind of the history. I will say to you that you know, transportation has been one of the things that I've been advocating for. As I said, I'm now on the board of the Capital District Transportation Authority here in Albany and have been for 20 years, but also involved in the national level. APTA, despite its efforts to fight against accessible transportation, has now been much more open and understanding that, you know, we are part of the public. And that's always the message, you know, that this isn't for, you know, this isn't special. It's the language that has been used around disability has all been about what's special or different or differently abled. And, you know, it's not special. We are part of the public and we need to be included as part of the public, and we want to be part of everyday life. So anyway, it makes me happy that I am now on the executive committee for APTA. My goal is to, at some point, actually chair APTA, and so I'm hoping to be able to do that in the next couple of years. I think that it would make a huge statement that they have truly embraced accessible transportation and people with disabilities as part of the community. And so I think what I'll do is I'll leave it at that and maybe open it up for questions if that works.
Yeah, I think that works great. What we can do is if everybody is muted currently, so if you raise your hand, I can unmute, or you can throw a question in the chat, and either myself or Gabriel will read that question out loud. And Denise, just to let you know, in the chat we have quite a number of thank yous for telling your story and sharing your story with us. And many folks also responded to the documentary Crip Camp, having seen it, and lots of positive remarks on that. So we have a question here, Denise, from Lindsay. Other than transportation, what do you think are the new frontiers for disability justice?
Well, you know, there's so many old frontiers we still haven't accomplished yet. I'm not sure, but you know, we certainly have a lot of challenges with technology. You know, we've got it's making sure that technology is fully accessible for folks with disabilities. You know, ironically, you know, folks who are blind, you know, were probably the first ones to use technology, you know, before any of the rest of us were using it, you know, in their day-to-day life. And what's happened over the years, and I think it's getting better, but, you know, what's happened is that that with all the visual stuff that's gone on with some of the technology, it's made it less accessible for blind people to use, you know, use the internet and you know, all the postings that get done without any you know, alternative text, et cetera, so that things have become less accessible over the years in terms of technology. So, you know, as we advance, I think that's one of the things is, you know, is making sure that we remember to be inclusive of people with all types of disabilities, you know, not only people who are blind, people who are deaf, but people who, you know, with cognitive disabilities as well, that, you know, the technology can be a great tool, but it also can be a huge hindrance if it's not done properly. So that's one of the, you know, one of the things I would say. You know, we still struggle with employment. Employment is, you know, a huge barrier. There's you know, with the ability for people to work from home, there should be greater opportunities for people to work, that, you know, maybe they don't have to deal with the transportation issues, etc. But I think it's still a huge barrier because there's so much misunderstanding about disability. And you know, we've accomplished a lot in terms of physical access, removing, you know, some of the barriers. But in terms of changing attitudes about disability, I think that, you know, that's still the huge battle. You know, and I know it takes time, but it's kind of sad that, you know, 30 years, 34 years after the ADA was passed, that we still have people not understanding or being afraid of people with disabilities. And, you know, in the news media, people with mental health disabilities get scapegoated all the time. You know, there's just all this fear around people who look different and who are different. And you know, I mean, that seems to be something that's worse in the culture at this point, you know, than it was before. So, not to be negative, but, you know, it's a serious issue that we continue to need to address, and we need to just get more people with disabilities in positions where they are seen as, you know, functioning, capable people who can do a job, you know, and not have employers be afraid to hire people with disabilities.
Right. So Denise, as you were speaking, there's two separate follow-up questions. So you choose the order you want to answer them in that
Sure.
address things that you were saying. The first would be about transportation. How would you say transportation has improved in New York State or within the US? And what areas would you like to see more improvement in? And then that second question, which is a pivot, but also part of what you're saying, is how do you think we as a society can welcome folks with disabilities in the community at large? So the individual actions I suppose we could be taking to make that culture shift happen.
Okay, well, I can deal with the transportation one probably easier and faster. You know, obviously, you know, we now have a mandate that all buses that are purchased have to be accessible. So, you know, every place where there's a fixed route bus, there's going to be access to that transit system. And it also there's also a requirement for corresponding or complementary paratransit wherever there's fixed route service. So, you know, in big cities and small cities, you know, transportation is more available. But, you know, you have areas like, you know, in upstate New York here, and even Westchester, Long Island, the issues around getting paratransit or getting transportation are more complicated because they only have to go a certain distance from the fixed route bus to provide that paratransit. So if you live outside of a mile from the fixed route system, you don't have any transportation available to you. So I think one of the you know, a lot of the transit systems are, at least in the cities where there is transit, a lot of systems are starting to introduce things like in the Capital District, we have something called Flex. So it's an on-demand thing, just like a ride share program, you know, where on an app you can ask for transportation, and those vehicles are supposed to be accessible, so that it provides a more on-demand service instead of paratransit, which has all sorts of limitations, 24 hours in advance notice, etc. I think that the transit systems need to improve how they're delivering paratransit. They need to come into the, you know, 21st century here and start using more real time transit instead of having to make your arrangements 24 hours in advance. That's not equal as far as I'm concerned. You know, everybody else who gets on a bus doesn't have to, you know, make a plan the day before to get on the bus at that time. They look at the schedule, or they don't even look at the schedule. Depends, you know, they can just show up at the bus stop and it's there. But if you need paratransit, you've got to call ahead of time. You have to negotiate your ride. It can be you need to get picked up at 9:00, but we can only get you at 8:30 in the morning or whatever it is, you know? And so, so they've got to change the paradigm, and there's certainly enough technology to be able to do that. I think that, the transit systems are still stuck in their old place, and still that's where the mind change has to be, that they understand that, again, the people with disabilities want the same thing that everybody else wants. We don't want a separate, different system. We want to be able to access transportation when we need it. So that's the answer in terms of transportation. It's a lot more difficult in rural areas because there is no transportation. And so there needs to be an effort, I think, on the part of the state to invest money in rural transportation for everybody. It's not just people with disabilities who need it. It prevents people from getting to jobs, and so workers who need to get, they can't even take advantage of a job if you can't get there. And the other question was, I'm sorry, what was the other question?
What was the other question? Let me scroll back up. There's a lot of follow-up questions. Everything you're saying, Denise, is sparking so much more follow-up conversation. So we talked about the transportation improvements, and then we have this follow-up question, which I think merges into another question that's come up. So I'll read those two again. So how do you think we as a society can welcome folks with disabilities in the community at large? It wasn't until I worked at OPWDD partner agencies that I realized how much of that misunderstanding you mentioned is extremely pervasive. And then we have a really great two-part question also along under the same theme of what can we do to better address discrimination? And can you speak about the benefit or challenges regarding incorporating all disabilities under one umbrella? Well, that's kind of a separate question. So we could talk about discrimination, addressing attitudes. What do you think that folks need to do, both I think individually and maybe as a society at large, on addressing that the stigma and the discrimination that exists?
Well, obviously education is what it's all about. It's about, on an individual level, educating yourself, maybe volunteering in an organization if you don't know folks with disabilities, volunteering in an organization that, serves people with disabilities. Start to get to spend time with people with disabilities. But on a broader level, I think that, it's exciting, that OCFS, your diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, person has pulled this together. I think more trainings to talk about the history and, and also just starting to think about what are your own, it's like anything else with whether it's racism or whatever it is, thinking about your own actions and or your own reactions to things, and being honest with yourself about that, and that's not always easy. That's not always easy, and it's important to have those conversations with other people, and so I think small groups that start talking about that, including obviously people with disabilities in those conversations, is important.
Thanks,
I don't know if that, I have no other brilliant response to it.
Well, we can also drill down to a more specific question. We're going to transition into Julie's part of the presentation. She'll tell us about some concrete ways that OCFS is supporting folks with disabilities. So just along those lines of discrimination and addressing those attitudes and stigma, let's kind of narrow that scope down to the workplace. And so can you speak a little bit on making the workplace more accommodating for people who may develop a disability during their career? So for example, say they have the less ability to travel, but the job requires traveling. What would you say? How do you adjust to that change? Should the individual pursue a new career, or do they have protections for their current job?
Yeah, as an independent living center, we hire a ton of people with disabilities, and obviously, you need to sit down with that person and look at the job and see what part of the job they can still do. Is there a way to divide it up? Maybe they don't have to do all the travel that they used to do. We have so much technology now that allows you to have these meetings and not be doing travel. And so maybe they can eliminate some of it. Maybe there's a coworker who could take on more travel, or it really kind of depends on the situation. But the most important thing is sitting down with that person and trying to figure out how they feel about it and what they think that could be done. So developing whatever reasonable accommodations need to happen. There are the law requires that you make reasonable accommodations to people with disabilities, that they can do the essential functions of their job. So you need to look at, is that an essential function of their job to do travel? It may have been historically part of it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be part of it. We have staff here who don't drive, who are blind, who can't necessarily go out and do that outreach, but they might pair up with another person who can take them, or we can make other arrangements for them, or maybe it's not something that they have to do. You don't want to limit somebody's abilities either by just assuming that they can't do something anymore. And so it's very important that you have that conversation.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Denise.
Sure.
I think this is a good segue into Julie's part of this presentation. So I'm going to hand it over to Julie to let folks know more about the Commission for the Blind and how it is part of the disability justice movement.
Thank you, Angelica. For people who came on later, my name is Julie Hovey, the Associate Commissioner here at the Commission for the Blind. First, I want to say the Commission for the Blind has always been proud to be part of the Office of Children and Family Services. We appreciate all the work that OCFS does, and particularly Angelica's office in terms of adding the A for DEI to DEIA for accessibility. Her team has done a lot of work, both internally and externally related to people with disabilities. So we thank her for that. The Commission for the Blind is a vocational rehabilitation agency. Our mission really is to enhance the employability of people who are blind, to maximize their independence, and to assist in helping them develop their strengths as someone with a visual impairment. We promote equal access to employment, full integration into the workplace through accessibility and workplace culture, which I did read in the chat from some folks that it's attitude, and I would very much agree that even with all the laws and legislation and things that Denise has mentioned, we still have work to do in terms of culture and attitude so that people do understand that people with disabilities can do the essential functions of jobs. In New York State, we're lucky to have the Commission for the Blind as well as Access VR, formerly known as VESID. They are part of the State Education Department. They are our sister agency. We are both federally funded through the Rehabilitation Services Administration, and both of us work to assist people in their attaining job skills and developing the skills they need to become employed. The Commission for the Blind, just for a little background, we were established by law in New York State in 1913. So we're over 100 years old. We're one of the oldest state agencies. And it was to maintain a census of people who are blind in New York and help people find suitable employment. We were also charged with researching the causes of blindness and advancing blindness prevention. In 1920, the state and federal partnership of vocational rehabilitation was created, and that's the National Vocational Rehabilitation Act. This established the need for vocational rehabilitation and the federal funding that we use to help people become employed. And then, Denise mentioned the Rehab Act, and I will say the Rehab Act from 1973 is over 50 years old. And is, probably one of the most important forms of legislation aside from the Americans with Disabilities Act to further people with disabilities' rights to become employed. Unfortunately, 70% of people who have a disability are unemployed. The numbers for people who have vision and hearing loss is significantly higher even. So obviously, we continue to advocate everywhere that people who are blind should become employed and have that right. Just a little more on the commission. We serve people of all ages. We start right after early intervention, working with children. Many children are born visually impaired or blind, and we provide as many services as we can at a young age to help them acclimate and develop all the skills that they need to be successful and independent. We also have an older blind program for anyone who is over 55 and either no longer working, maybe retired, and is still interested in being independent, living in their home. The number one part of that service is to keep people living in their homes and in the community. We do a lot of outreach with people in nursing homes, assisted livings, and all those types of places to ensure that if people want to live in the community, they don't need to live in an institution just because of their vision loss. We have the Business Enterprise Program, which we are very proud of. And for anyone here at 52 Washington, we have a store. We have the state priority to be in a state building, a federal building. That's called the Randolph-Shepard Act. That's federal legislation. Anytime there is going to be vending or a facility, people who are blind have that priority. So we oversee that program. We have just over 60 managers statewide who work throughout the state, and they are really considered self-employed, running their own businesses with some support. We do provide services to people who are deaf blind, and I just want to make that mention. So sometimes people that we're working with have both vision and hearing loss. There are some progressive disorders that can cause that. We also work with a lot of people who have diabetes, because diabetes is still the leading cause of vision loss. We have 7 district offices and 9 outstations. We are located throughout the state. It's very easy to get started with us. So if you or anyone that you know is in need of assistance, please reach out to us. And we provide a wide range of rehabilitation services, employment and training, college sponsorship, computer training, on-the-job technical support for an employee or an employer. We do have employers that reach out to us when they're either interested in hiring someone who's blind, or if they have employees who are blind and they're interested in getting some on-the-job support from us. We also do disability awareness training for any organization or business interested. And thank you for having me.
Thank you, Julie. Just sorting ourselves out here. So thank you so much for this really critical presentation, Denise and Julie. And I wanted to just briefly touch upon what CFS is doing in addition to Commission of the Blind's work. We're really talking about moving from the disability rights framework to one of disability justice. So this is a framework where the lives and voices of the disabled are celebrated, empowered, and valued in our everyday policy and practices. So what are some ways we're doing this? As Julie mentioned, part of the history of my office, ODEIA used to just be ODEI. And when I started in late 2021, we very intentionally added the A for accessibility to the office's title and purpose, because it was made clear to me early that our equity and inclusion efforts had actually failed to fully address the needs of our own employees with disabilities, which is a terrible oversight that needed to be addressed immediately. So ever since we've added the A, we have prioritized grappling with and addressing how disability and accessibility factor into other issues of inequity and disparity. Also at ODEIA, we have an accessibility and disability justice subcommittee, and that's where the origins of this presentation began. So I appreciate that subcommittee's work in the begin the foundations of this presentation. And it's a group of really committed employees who serve as a bit of a brain trust for DEIA as we examine how OCFS can better serve people with disabilities. So please reach out to me or anybody at ODEIA to discuss how you can join the subcommittee. We're always looking for more people with lived experience, both as a person with disabilities or somebody who supports a person with a disability, to help us brainstorm and understand what the agency can do to create environments that are supportive of disabled people, and to take those hard-won gains from the disability justice movement as lessons in what we can do to be truly diverse, equitable, inclusive, and accessible. I'm also really excited to discuss Executive Order 31, which is a statewide executive order that was issued on July 27th, 2023, that commits New York State to becoming a model employer for people with disabilities. So this executive order has led to OCFS's Executive Order 31 strategic plan, and that commits OCFS to objectives and concrete steps geared towards improving the hiring of people with disabilities and improving disability inclusiveness. So disability inclusiveness requires an environment that is not only accessible and welcoming of disabilities, but also proactively and respectfully supportive. So at OCFS, we're really starting to think about how we can ensure our practices are consistent with our values. And today's presentation of the history of the disability justice movement are hopefully going to ground us in our work, remembering where we came from so we know where we're going. As we come to this presentation's close, I just really wanted to thank Denise for sharing your story and your incredible contributions to the movement. I feel really, really privileged to have gotten to know you over the course of planning this presentation. I hope you will consider us a friend. OCFS is a friend. I really enjoyed our interactions. Thank you so much, Julie, for sharing about the Commission of the Blind and for being such a critical part of this agency learning, as well as my own individual learning. Denise, it was asked if we could share your contact information for folks, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
wonderful. So we'll throw that in the chat for anybody who wants to get in touch with Denise. And I know that there were follow-up questions. I love that, and I'm going to make sure I take note of them, and we are going to continue to grow in our learning and education with each other so that we can really change and shift the attitudes and behaviors of this agency. So questions that went unanswered today will be answered. Please continue to engage with us. Please continue to ask questions and offer solutions. With that, I will close out the presentation, and I hope that everybody enjoys the rest of their day. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.